Hello, my name's Ben, and I'm an artist and an interaction designer, and I'm here today to talk to you about Bring the Happy. But before I do, I would like you to do something, if that's okay. I'd like you to take a second to pick out a moment of happiness from your life. Now pick out a good one, make it count, and make sure that you think about these three things. What was it? Try and picture very clearly where it happened. And thirdly, but importantly, how happy it made you on a scale of 1 to 10. Okay? Now just hang on to it, because I'm going to come back to it right at the end of the talk. Now, Bring the Happy is a project that I do with my two colleagues, Victoria and Richard, as part of our company called Invisible Flock. It's an attempt to map the happiness of the whole of the UK. We've been in Exeter for 3 weeks. We set up shop in the old Oggy Oggy pasty shop on Queen Street, which some of you may know. And what we do is we fill it with giant maps of the city that we're in. We run it from 9 to 5, 6 days a week, and ask people to come in and to leave us memories or stories of happiness that have taken place at any point in their lives, anywhere on our map. We ask them to tell us what it was, where it happened, and how happy it made them on a scale of 1 to 10. Each memory is then placed onto the map with its own unique glass 3D rod, the height of which is determined by the 1 to 10 happiness rating. So if you came in and left me a 1 out of 10, your mark would be about this big, 10 out of 10 is about that big, and everything in between. So we get this gradually evolving, sort of undulating landscape of our emotional geography in the places where we live. Now, we've been running the project all over the country, and it's about to go international soon, and it doesn't seem to be running out of steam. People seem to be drawn to the idea of talking about happiness. But not the problem, but the only issue that I want to talk to you about today is that there's something that's a little bit of a lie about the premise. Now, it's not a purposeful lie, I wouldn't do that, I like you too much. But rather, it's more of an emergent lie, something that gradually started to appear the more that we did the project. We first noticed it in Leeds, which is where we live and where we first ran it in 2 empty market stalls. And every time we've done it since, it's become more and more true. And it's that the title, Bring the Happy, or even just that word, happiness, it's a bit more complicated than it first seems. Now, we've collected nearly 4,000 memories for all over the country. And what we're discovering is that happiness is an excuse, it's a hook. It's a way in for us to start having a conversation together about the places where you live. Ask a stranger, or in our case, ask 4,000 strangers to pick out a single moment of happiness about the place where they live. And what you're actually starting to do is to unpeel away layer upon layer upon layer of meaning of the cities in which we live. Now, we first started doing Bring the Happy when the politicians around us were talking about broken Britain. Do you remember that? It's about 4 years ago. And when we started doing it, the recession was beginning to cut swathes through our city centres. Where we live up in Yorkshire, it felt like our city centres were collapsing, and the voids that they were leaving was dragging the rest of the city and with them a sort of urban whirlpool of decay. And all the while, the media and the politicians were on television, and they were going, society is broken, Britain is broken, you are broken. And you'd walk through your city centre, and these caverns that were left by these seemingly invincible retail giants with a salt in the wound, they felt like the reminder that the fact that we couldn't walk into our towns and buy stuff was somehow our fault. So we weren't the first to do this, but we wanted to reprogram these spaces, to think, is there a different way that we can use them? To turn them instead into places of community and of meeting. And so we thought we'd fill them with some big maps and ask people to come and talk to us about happiness. And then the memories started coming in. And the stories that people began to give us were mind-blowing. They were mind-blowing in their beauty. They were mind-blowing in sometimes their epicness or their tragicness, or even just in the mundaneness that we could all relate to. But what they all did, without exception, is that they all told us something unique about the way that we live in the cities that we do. Now, there's a lot of studies that have been done about happiness, and there's a lot of TED Talks that have been done about happiness. You've probably seen some of them. And they're fine. But I do have a slight problem with them as well. Now, the problem for me is that a lot of them look at emotion and look at us and our happiness through this really particular prism. It's sort of a prism of kind of post-industrialism, where it kind of tries to sum us down into this sort of formula. So I'm a digital artist, which means I mess around with code. So I thought I'd try and make a gibberish algorithm of what I think a lot of these people are trying to say when they talk to us about happiness. Don't type this into anything, it won't work. I'm going to explain why it won't work. Because the constant that we have at the top there is society. That's our constant variable. That's us. That's all of us. And what a lot of these great minds think is that if people and happiness is bigger than sadness, i.e. we're happy, then that means society will become more productive. And if we become more productive, we will become richer. And that leaves us in the perfect opportunity to loop and repeat ad infinitum. Happiness, more productivity, more richness, more happiness, more productivity, etc., 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 etc. Now, I'm not going to say that's wrong. I'm sure the economics aren't. But what I'm going to say is that I think it's a shame. I think it sells the notion of happiness and what our emotions mean so terribly short. And what it doesn't do is that it doesn't take into account what happiness actually tells us about the places that we live. So, in Leeds, where we live, there were some flats called the Quarry Hill Flats. They were built in 1936. You'll have your equivalent of these pretty much in every single city of the UK. They were the future. They were living in the sky, we were told. Not that I was alive in 1936, but so I hear. And what they did is that they took places, slums, and they cleared them out. So they moved people out of their houses, and they knocked the houses down, and they built these flats, and they moved people back into the flats. Everyone lived in this sort of self-contained vertical village. And that was going to be the future. Until, obviously, as we all know, and as these things do, they began to decay, they began to fall apart, and then they became labeled as slums. People were moved out, the building was bulldozed, and they were exploded back across the city. The communities were shattered. And there is nothing there now to mark that this ever existed. But when we ran Bring the Happy in Leeds, we met hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of people who said that for them, the single most defining happy period of their life was when they lived in these flats. And the only thing that is there to mark them now is a Nando's and a bunch of new media buildings. In Lille, where we also work in France, there's a place called Roubaix, which has these beautiful red brick factories that used to be the center of a textile industry, and generations of families worked there. When that industry died, there's been a systematic local government idea that they're going to try and get rid of them because they don't work anymore. They remind us of what's wrong. But as these buildings fall down, there is nothing that is left to mark the memories and the lives that were there. There is nothing that we are building for the people whose memories are associated with these places. Someone sent me this, it's in Exeter, and I think it's very relevant to what I'm talking about, which is that where are we building a space for emotion and memory in these physical places that we're building around us? We know how to remember our hurt and our trauma and our scars. We know how to build memorials for our fallen. In Ypres, every day at 8, without fail, the traffic stops and a single bugle player plays the last call. That is beautiful. That is fantastic. But where do we build or where do we celebrate our joys? Where are our wins? And I don't mean our big wins. I don't mean our golden phone boxes for Olympic race runners in our hometowns. Those are fantastic. Where are our wins? You and me, the people who have these pivotal, life-changing moments. How do we celebrate that? How do we mark those in our city? For me, the place where I proposed to my wife, or the beaten-down brick wall in Derby train station where we shared a bottle of wine waiting for a bus replacement service, that's always going to be our Eiffel Tower. That's going to matter more. And how do we construct our cities to accommodate for these moments, to create for this? I like to think of our lives as graffiti, and too seldom are we allowed the freedom to paint them onto the places in which we live. Now, I think that for me, we're in real danger as a society if we can't take this dictum. You'll have heard it. It's used by protesters the world over. And instead, incorporate it into our lives. Think of cities as porous places, places where we don't bounce against the concrete when we fall on it, but rather it envelops us and it lets us become part of it. Our cities are ours, and they should serve us. They should enable us to live better, to create memories, and to be remembered in them. Whose streets? Our streets. Because there are streets and there are lives. So what I'd like you to do is to take the happy memory that you thought about at the beginning, and I'd like you maybe to turn to the person next to you and share it. Wait for me to go off stage. And then share it with each other. And then when you leave here today, perhaps you could take that memory and you could use it like a lens. This is what we try and do when we invite people into our shops to share their moments with us, when the memory of an 80-year-old woman sits there next to the memory of a 12-year-old boy, spanning class and generations and time. Those two memories are talking to each other, whether you want them to or not. And I think that maybe that might be the beginning of how we can start to think about cities differently. I've not provided any answers today, it's just a whole new bunch of problems. But I think that perhaps some of those problems can eventually turn into things that we talk about and can change the way that we try and live in the places around us. So take that happy memory, think about it, and use it as a lens to better live in the places where you do. Thank you very much.